Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We'll move on to the next panel. My name is James Heappey. I was from 2019 until 2024 the UK Deputy Defence Minister, and now working with various defence companies from the US, UK and Europe. And it's my pleasure to chair a stellar panel of experts as we consider the European security capability and the new transatlantic relationship and what has gone well in terms of Europe's reaction to the security situation that we find ourselves in versus where Europe might need to do more. Before we get on with the conversation, may I introduce our wonderful panel. Immediately to my right, your left, Jana Puglierin is the head of the Berlin office and senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Next to her is Matti Pesu, who is the senior research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Next, Ashley Rhoades, defence policy researcher from the RAND Corporation. Then Sylvie Matelly, the director of the Jacques Delors Institute. And finally, Rautalinko, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Patria. You're all very welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I thought that the President of Finland teed up this conversation very well indeed. He gave some very candid reflections on the way that the negotiations are going, on the level of agency that he, as a European head of state, feels that he has in those discussions. And I was heartened by the confidence that he showed that because of the relationship that he enjoys with Trump and his administration, that he felt that he had a voice and some influence. And I thought also it was positive that he reflected that other European leaders enjoy that too. And we've seen some of that in the way that Trump reacted to his reception in the UK over the last 48 hours or so. So all is not to despair of in theory. But he noted quite an important word of caution at the end of his talk, where he said that fundamentally the big countries decide. And we have a Brit, a German and a French person on the panel. And I wonder whether any of our countries any longer count as big countries in Trump's mind as to how these decisions are ultimately made, which brings with it the grim possibility that no matter how much we may schmooze and seek to influence, ultimately, the emerging European security architecture and even the threats that we face over the next 20 or 30 years might ultimately be imposed on us by a decision taken in Washington. And I think that that is quite sobering. It means that Europe needs to be very, very realistic about what Europe and Europe alone must do in order to be more able to act autonomously as Europe and to manage our own security. It means we've got to be very smart about the way we engage the US and keep them engaged in our continental security and how we express to the US and its policymakers the importance of the Euro-Atlantic geography to the US interest. And thirdly, it means we need to make some reflections on what US disinvestment from our continent leaves exposed and the speed at which Europe is responding to those potential deficiencies. So I'm going to open up to our panel and start, if I may, Jana, with you. What is your sense of European agency in the deal that will be done? Particularly, how does Germany seek to take a lead in that deal or not? But is there the appetite in Berlin to be that leader, both diplomatically and militarily?
So maybe I start with the first aspect of your question. How much agency is there? How capable are we Europeans of shaping the outcome of the negotiations? And I was also heartened to see President Stubb and his personal relationship with President Trump. But my role here is a think tanker, so I need to be more critical. And what I have observed during the NATO summit, but also during the Alaska summit, is that, yes, Europeans have been very united, unusually united, and have shown a lot of unity and coordination when it comes to nudging President Trump where they wanted him to go, but with, I think, limited success. And I think one of the problems is that our energy and our focus is very much on how to keep the United States on board, how to follow Trump in his decisions and movements, and how to, basically try to not lose track and not lose his sympathy. I mean, we involve kings and castles and everything, so we do everything in our power, but we are not enough focused on what do we want and what is basically our joint agenda. How do we want, as Europeans, this war to end? So I think we are more focused on trying to influence Trump not to do the wrong thing than thinking about what should we as Europeans do. So I think our shaping power is somewhat limited, as we have seen during the Alaska summit. I mean, there was broad agreement that there needs to be a ceasefire before the negotiations start. And the first thing that Donald Trump did was basically saying, oh, well, there doesn't need to be a ceasefire. And that was rewarding President Putin. So I think this is a problem. When it comes to Germany, I see a lot of ambition coming from the new government. Actually, I saw that coming from the old government as well. We see a lot of talking in Berlin about the special responsibility that Germany carries, about the role. And I think Germany actually can make a difference because the new thing now is that we have the money. And I think it's now about investing the money that Germany now basically can work with and to invest it wisely and in a European way. And because I think it's not only about more money, it's about also better investing that money. And I think there is this understanding. Sometimes I'm actually a bit puzzled by the reactions I get abroad. I followed a debate in Poland recently, in Polish, about the speech that Friedrich Merz has given at the ambassadors' conference, where he was not mentioning Poland. And that created a lot of mistrust in Poland immediately, a lot of speculation about Germany wanting now to create a European security order without giving prominent role to Poland. He was only mentioning France and the UK. And that is sometimes what makes me a bit skeptical about how prepared is Europe, and that's my really last sentence, for a Germany that has the biggest army in Europe and that is really a military power that has basically no immediate comparison in Europe, because that is the goal. That's what Merz said. He wants to make the German army the biggest army in Europe.
I spent an awful lot of time as a British minister saying to the German media that I think they now trust you to be the leading military continental power, and times now require it.
That's what I've told my compatriots, but traveling through Europe, I think actually we were both not always right. I think there is still mistrust.
Yes. Sylvie, I'm going to ask you the inverse of the question, because whereas there's the money in Berlin, is there the intent? In Paris, there's definitely the intent, but is there the money?
Yeah, thank you very much. For sure, we don't have money, but I think we spend a lot and we maintain a sort of whole defense capabilities. And thinking about the question you may ask me and seeing what you asked to my colleague, I thought, well, what can I answer? And maybe that will answer to the question finally you asked me. The lack we have thinking our defense in Europe, and the reason why we feel, and I say we feel and I underline we feel so dependent from the US, is probably a lack of strategic culture. And in that field, if we want to invest in our defense and if we want to spend money, and this is not just money, defense. This is also a culture. This is also this is much more comprehensive than only investing in defense and in defense capabilities. And I would say what we lack and what I will integrate in that idea that we have a strong lack in strategic culture, this is probably to integrate and to redefine what we would like to go, and I join what you said yet, what we would like to go investing in defense. And I think that's the core of our strategic autonomy. Today, we have not the strategic autonomy because we are dependent. We are dependent not only in defense. Even if we invest in defense, we will stay dependent on energy, digital and chips, raw materials and rare earths. That's the first way. Second way, we used to invest in our defense. We invest a lot in our defense since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and that's a huge progress, and that's really interesting. But in the same time, we perfectly know that to ensure the European security, we have to spend more, better, and together. That's not my idea, that's written in all the European documents. And because we have a lack of integration, we waste a lot of money, a lot of knowledge and capabilities. And improving strategic culture will mean to think our European security together, but investing together in improving our integration, improving probably the integration of the European market, etc., etc. The other difficulty we may have in front of us is that we have different interests. For some people, European defense means producing more. For others, it means buying armament to the US. Why? Because we want to preserve Article 5 and we want to preserve the security guarantee from the US. And that's a problem. What do we want? And talking about the European pillar of NATO or the European pillar of our security in Europe may supposed to answer that question urgently. If we want to improve our industrial capabilities, we need to invest in Europe, not buying armament to the US. But in the same time, doing that, we know that we will lose the support of the US. Then that's a really important element. And after, and I will finish with that, I think we also need to do a huge job, and we began after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and I think things are changing, and the unity we had since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, but also the support European citizens still have for Ukraine in that war are good indications of the beginning of change in our mindset. But we have to remember where we were before the war in Ukraine. We were in a peaceful region, and people were convinced that we will be in peace for an eternity in reality. And that's really an important element to integrate. And finally, and to conclude, I think, I didn't answer to the French question, but just saying that you don't just need money to invest in defense. Another problem we had, what do you mean by European? Mm-hmm. Most of the time, you think about the EU when you are living in the EU, because there is a lot of initiatives. We put in place a lot of instruments to improve our defense in Europe and in the European Union. But in the same time, there is not any. The European institutions and the Commission has not the competence to do anything in defense. Then whatever it tried to do is dependent on the agreement of state and the council, and that's a difficulty also. And we can see that we are also in Europe. We may also work with the UK, that's really important, and the UK is not anymore in the EU. Then that's a sort of the institutional issue is also a big issue.
Well, let's discuss, because what's extraordinary is we are 14 minutes into a discussion on European security, and I don't think the NATO word has been mentioned once, which is interesting in itself. Matti, I'm going to throw this your way. I served in a government that delivered Brexit, although I voted Remain. But as a defence minister, it's blindingly obvious to me that the European Union has a really fundamental role in underpinning European defence, whether or not it actually is people going over the ramparts, carrying the EU flag, and being the active defenders in its own right, discuss. But that tension of NATO delivering the force, the EU mobilising industry, making sure that all the military mobility is as it should be, that supply chains are resilient, that the economic and diplomatic levers are pulled on behalf of Europe, seems to be exactly where the EU should be. Matti, we've explored briefly UK, French, German leadership of a European security architecture. The missing bit of the discussion is the EU and NATO. Coming from a country that has recently joined NATO and therefore must be full of enthusiasm for the alliance, what are your reflections?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, and on my behalf as well, welcome to Helsinki Security Forum. What a staple club it is, I must say, from Finland's perspective. So it's been, let's say, quite eventful 2 years, despite the fact that the Finnish integration has proceeded quite well. What we've seen so far and what we've witnessed in The Hague, that there is clearly now a new trend, and there are new buzzwords going around in capitals, such as burden shifting. But I think that seems to be the direction set in motion by the Trump administration. And for us Europeans, what it means first and foremost, it's taking more responsibility in conventional security. That's what also the Americans have underscored, that Europe must step up in conventional security. And that's not easy for several reasons. For example, well, first, like the Americans have maintained quite robust and significant forward presence after the Second World War. And it's been also like an embodiment of that US commitment and even US nuclear deterrence, that there's been a strong link between nuclear deterrence and conventional deterrence. If the US decides to decrease its foothold, and if Europe will take the primary role in conventional security, what does it mean for the US commitment if they are less present in Europe? That's a big question. Another question, and here I'd like to react to points made by Sylvie and Jana about European defence and what it means for the Europeans to step up in NATO. And we've talked about money, and I don't want to belittle the like very financial challenges, but sometimes it feels that the money is the easy part, because we're like facing systemic changes that go far beyond like procurement. We were talking about like real operational planning, total defense, security of supply, civilian defense, and even the reintroduction of conscription as a fourth generation tool. And with regard to these questions, I think here we enter the realm of legitimacy. Do citizens across Europe see such moves as legitimate? Is there sufficient long-term commitment to build and sustain such systems? And the fundamental question here, I believe, is that you really can't mobilize a society that hasn't been convinced that it's at risk. And does the majority of Europeans really think that we're at risk? And this is also absolutely instrumental, like a fundamental factor underpinning European defense efforts in the future.
But before I move on, I'd like to come to Ita in a second, just to get a reflection from the industrial perspective. But why, 11 years after the annexation of Crimea, 3 years after the renewal of the war against Ukraine at large. Why does that public perception still lag behind? Why are treasuries and ministries for finance still not opening up the purse strings and spending the money with the urgency that the geopolitics seem to demand?
Yeah, there's a difference whether you ramp up because of an existential threat or due to alliance solidarity. Of course, alliance solidarity is fine, and that's important. But there's a strong link between like a nation's exposure to threat and its investments in security, and still say that the majority of the European countries perhaps do not feel sufficiently exposed to the threat from Russia. This is not the question here in the front line, but elsewhere it may be. And coming back to the point that you really can't invest for a danger that you don't necessarily feel. So I think that's the core problem and a challenge.
So I want to pick up on something that Sylvie said with you, because I've heard it reflected often that the US gets effectively much more hardware for the money it spends because it spends money on fewer models. There are fewer fighter jets in the US Air Force fleet. There are fewer vehicles in the US Air Force Army. The challenge is in Europe that it's not a very popular argument if we say, well, let's build all ships with BAE systems, let's build all planes with Safran, and let's build all tanks with Rheinmetall, because every country necessarily wants to preserve its own industry. You clearly probably agree with the latter argument. So how do we pick up on Sylvie's challenge? How do we cooperate in terms of defence procurement and defence manufacture, whilst recognising that EU member states and the UK will vigorously defend their own national industries and want those national industries to get a slice of the European defence spending pie?
Maybe I'll just start saying that during the ending of the Cold War, if it ever ended, but actually the defence industry wasn't really growing. And that was a time when the European protectionism really started when it comes to defense material. Now clearly, and actually unfortunately, where that always leads is that less performance, which is compensated by higher prices. So a very, very bad equation. Now a more dramatic consequence of that one is Ukraine, unfortunately, is now paying a certain price. If we take field guns, artillery, depending on how one counts that, US has maximum 2 different systems. Europe has, nobody knows exactly, between 15 or 20. And even with the same caliber, slightly different ammunition, so that the original equipment manufacturers have protected their chains. So I think that's a problem. What the militaries have been talking about for a long, long time is interoperability. What we also need to understand is interchangeability, which actually means that the more we have common parts and spare parts and so forth, so they are naturally, they are obvious advantages to that one. What the industry has realized, and I think the picture is not as grim as one might think. I think the industry cooperation has been there for a long, long time. So it's only the tip of the iceberg who is the final assembler or producer of certain equipment. There's a huge chain, a supply chain beneath. Even the biggest companies in the world are not self-sufficient. So there is this cooperation going on. How to tackle certain things over here for sure. So I think that comes to EU regulation, and now also good news is that the new European instruments when it comes to financing and so forth. So there are certain rules and regulations what needs to be done. And there is a number of already successful joint programs when it comes to the EU. I think, and the industry understands this for sure. So at the end of the day, so I think we've heard political speeches or not, we've read papers more or less for at least 3.5 years. Enough talk, enough papers, not enough action. So those decisions are still pending. And despite of all of these obstacles, so the industries the industry is cooperating. I also want to underline one, sort of a blink of a bright light. When it comes to the EU, any of the EU countries and the US, defense material is exempt of tariffs. There are no tariffs. There are certain tariffs when it comes to manufacturing equipment and so forth. Should there be more defense industry located in the US from European countries? For sure, that's what has been done for decades. And all of the European countries also want to have the proximity of delivery capabilities. There's nothing new in this one. Then one thing, even though we are talking about that the EU is buying a lot of US-produced equipment, that's a fact. There's also a lot of capabilities that only Europe produces. US does not have those capabilities on US soil. So there is this ongoing reliance of both of the parties, this bilateral arrangement and understanding about the defense capabilities, how they are kept up and developed. So cooperation is the name of the game. So then what we need to realize, to give you a picture. So today, Western European countries are spending slightly over 300 billion euros combined to defense, of which around 1/3 goes to defense investments. And of defense investments, almost 90% are new capabilities. That share has been increasing very, very rapidly. Now the question is that what is enough? So bearing in mind that the deficit of NATO countries from the end of the Cold War until the end of 23, if the countries, and bearing in mind that the number of NATO countries has almost tripled ever since. Still, if we would take the 2% of GDP, which was only introduced in 2014, but even the cumulative spend is, we have a deficit of $1.6 trillion over here. If the spend was on the same level when it used to be during the Cold War time, the deficit is 8.6 trillion. Now the question is that how do we move forward? So yes, there is the urgency in the industry. I think all the defense forces understand where we need to be. Then it comes to the sovereign states, what's their position on this one, and the EU naturally needs to understand how to take certain obstacles away from this one. So that's where we basically stand. But I think there's a lot of hope. The industry is employing people. And maybe one final comment. Instead of defense spend or expenditure, we need to start talking about defense revenue. Even though it might sound a little bit awkward, but still bearing in mind that there's around 600,000 people today in the EU who are employed by defense. And that's growing very rapidly at the moment. If we are even halfway where the Commission wants us to be in 2030, there will be in the ballpark of 500,000 new jobs in the EU. There will be taxes, welfare and so forth, and an additional bonus of increased safety and security. So that's where we are. And maybe making just one final note of what we need to understand, and when you just made the point that why are we still discussing about certain things 14 years after, or 10 years, 11 years after. Human psychology. People tend to take a convincing lie instead of an inconvenient truth. Every single time if we are not able to make a convincing case. So that's where we are.
But before I let you off the hook for now, I just want to play back to you two arguments, opposing arguments that were made often at DSEI last week. So the world's defence industry gathered in East London at a big exhibition called DSEI. On the political policy side of the argument, was complaint that Europe's defence primes are all enjoying really increased share prices on the basis of really full and extended order books, that to the point that it will take sort of 15 years to get a frigate out of this shipbuilding company, or 5 years to get a tank out of this armoured fighting vehicle company, which of course is great for the chief executive of those businesses. The share prices are really high, the order book is really full, business looks really secure, but when you're in a race to arm ahead of a possible act of Russian aggression, it's not necessarily the share price and the order book that matters, it's the speed of manufacture. Yeah. So that was the argument that was being made on the political policy side. But chief executives were queuing up to say that the defence industry is a coin-operated machine, where are the contracts? And that, you know, for all the rhetoric, and you just made this point, for all the rhetoric, with the notable exception of a couple of countries, the money is not actually yet being spent at the velocity that the rhetoric demands. Can you just sort of unpick those two arguments? Is the first one unfair? And why are governments not yet spending the money, in your opinion?
Well, I think the first comment, I think the argument is fair, and I'm very free to say that one, because actually my company is state majority owned, so I don't have to worry about the share price at all. What is interesting at the moment for sure is that the lead times are very, very long. Depends, but I think, and I don't want to underestimate the complexity of producing defense material, but they can be substantially shortened. I'll just give one example because it has been publicized. Denmark ordered vehicles from Patria, made an order in July this year. The first vehicles are already delivered over to Denmark. So things can be done, and there are certain ways how to arrange and so forth. Then, secondly, I think still, let's put it this way, I think people are not focused enough on the things, maybe, where they can really make an impact on. So people are generally worrying about things that actually they can't really make a difference in. So I think it's about the industry needs to focus on industry, the militaries need to focus on those, and then we need to decide actually who's going to take care of what. And I think that this is still a little bit confusing for many. But I think at this time, so I think shortening delivery times is absolutely, I would assume it's on every CEO's agenda, certainly, because everybody needs to have revenue in as soon as possible. And the ones who are operating and leading listed companies, they need to convince the investors that actually this is not a bubble, that actually we are able to go forward. So I think that's on everybody's agenda for sure. Just make one argument also when it comes to European sovereignty and the production on European soil. So I already made the argument about cooperation. There's no way we can manage without US-based technology, and it goes both ways. But even if even if all the European NATO countries would agree that let's develop something from the scratch today, depending on the technology, so there are certain technologies that if we start today, they might be ready in 2060. So incredibly long lead times. Fighter jets. There's not a single fifth generation fighter jet produced in Europe today. The US is leading that race. So then there are these arguments about the sixth generation and so forth, and hopefully those go well. But before any of those are in operational use, we are all going to be pretty old. So therefore, in order to make sure that we play this smartly, so we need to recognize the lead times as well, or certain missile systems and so forth, not knowing what certain companies have already developed. But 5 years is a very, very short period of time, even 10 years. Realistically, 20, 30, even 40 years. So that's where we are, and that's the price, unfortunately, what we are paying from what Europe did between 1990 and 2022.
Indeed. Now, Ashley, deeply unfair to make you Caroline Leavitt for 5 minutes and become the sort of spokesperson for the administration. But can you share with us what this all looks like from your side of the Atlantic? there are some in Europe who think that all we've got to do is time out the Trump administration and someone more reasonable will arrive in the White House and we can all go back to building hospitals and doing lots of social welfare and the Americans have got our security again. How permanent is this pivot? And how do Americans on both sides of the aisle and the wider public regard European attitudes to European security?
Sure. So first of all, thank you for having me here as the lone American on stage. And so I think at the risk of, well, being outnumbered by the Europeans on this stage, let me attempt to put on that hat for a second and mount a valiant defense of my country's policy. I think, James, you mentioned at the outset, that if we can't, or if the Europeans can't find a way to effectively communicate with Washington, that there's a risk of having terms dictated to them by the Trump administration, by Washington. Respectfully, let me try to flip that a little bit. I think that's not, if not an inaccurate frame, I think it's not the most helpful framing. I think that given the sort of slow and uneven trajectory that we've seen, that we've heard a little bit about from all of the panelists in terms of NATO progression to include the United States in that bucket relative to the increasing Russian threat, which really has been on display openly since at least 2008 with Georgia. I think that if we collectively as NATO, the US and European allies don't fix our vulnerabilities now, we're actually at risk of having Moscow dictate terms to us. And so I think that is what we need to really focus on. That is not to absolve the US of any, obviously, difficult dynamics that we've had and challenges, again, that we are dealing with in our own defense industrial base, among other things. But I do think that it's most helpful to have the focus be on the shared Russian threat and what that actually translates into in terms of burden sharing or burden shifting or whatever the latest terminology is. I think that being said, I am a fervent supporter of NATO. I very much was encouraged that President Trump did select another American SACEUR. I think that is a good sign of our continued commitment to the alliance, I hope. And I do think that we need to be a little bit self-reflective as an alliance in terms of where there are persistent problems, even if there is sustained US commitment going forward. So to your point about, is this an enduring trend? I mean, certainly the Trump administration has been the most sort of vociferous about calling for increased spending, increased burden shifting toward our European allies. But I do think that this is something that, if you look back historically, I think even going back as far as President Carter, you can find instances of American presidents calling for Europe to do more. They were just a lot more muted about it. So I don't think it got as much traction, especially given the perception that the Russian threat had sort of tapered off at the time. I think the reason I say we should focus collectively, and again, I really do include the US in this, on the Russian threat, is I think that even if we assume that there is a sustained level of US commitment going forward, that does not absolve NATO of the challenges that it has relative to Russia. Even, of course, the picture gets significantly rosier if the US is all in. However, I think in the areas we heard about defense industrial base capacity, defense spending, because the 5% target declared at the Hague Summit is definitely a step in the right direction, but and I'm not an economist, so I will defer on this one to those on the panel that have more knowledge in that sense. But even just looking at the viability of reaching 5% across the board, I think that is going to be a gigantic struggle, especially looking at sort of debt to GDP ratios and what the EU finds acceptable. The list goes on and on of the challenges, and we haven't even really touched on the operational challenges yet in terms of getting the right, well, I guess we started to allude to the right systems on board fast enough, the inherent interoperability challenges that exist. Having 32 countries, both our greatest strength and our greatest weakness, because we inherently have to be interoperable, whereas Russia just has to deal primarily with itself. And then there's also the questions that we haven't delved into in terms of force sourcing and ensuring we have the right forces in the right place. And I know that's something that in Finland resonates a lot because somebody mentioned it at the outset. Finland has one of the largest militaries in terms of wartime strength readiness in NATO, and you are on the front line. So these are all vulnerabilities as far as I look at it. And I think things that we collectively need to address, in addition to trying to figure out, as we were sort of joking prior to this, what sort of the best way of getting the administration on board would be. I think the better focus would be, let's look at where there are vulnerabilities, even with US presence, and target those as immediate priorities.
I want to come back to the question in a second, but Jana caught my eye.
Yeah, because it sounds so nice to focus collectively on the shared Russian threat. But I think it doesn't make sense to pretend that this is still the case. And I just give you a couple of examples. I mean, I was struck by Secretary of State Marco Rubio's interview, where he basically said, well, how the war in Ukraine ends does not affect an American citizen. It does not change the life of a housewife in Iowa, but it very much changes the life of, I think, the nations that would be much closer to Russian troops. And I think what we've seen from the US administration so far is exactly that this collective threat is not felt any longer, and that the Euro-Atlantic security landscape is split into a European security landscape and an American or US security landscape. And I think that is actually what we've also, I mean, it was papered over during the NATO summit. President Trump signed the declaration, but now the Russia's threat is a half sentence in this communique. It's not front and center, but for the Europeans, it is. I mean, we are not always reacting as if it was. We talk about existential, but then nobody wants to really invest skin in the game, as we now see with this reassurance force. But I think that is actually the real problem. The real problem is that many Europeans believe that if Ukraine falls, their country might be next. And in the United States, at least this administration does not believe in this domino theory. And I've heard them saying this to me out loud. And I think that is basically the problem we are facing, that we are no longer able to look at a shared Russian threat.
Actually, do respond, and then Sylvie wants to come in as well. A reminder that this isn't Carolina.
And it's not against you.
No. And if I could just, a quick response. So, I mean, I totally take your points. I do think, though, that within Europe, you alluded to it, there's been a disconnect between rhetoric and
Totally
implementation and action. And I would push back a little bit on the idea that all of Europe sees the Russian threat with the acute nature that obviously Finland, the Baltics, Poland, increasingly Germany as well does. And I think that's really what I'm alluding to in terms of getting all of the Europeans on the same page, because in order to go at it, which I again hope does not happen, but in order to think about where to or how to approach vulnerabilities as Europe separate from the US, as the framing we were given in the beginning, I think that really starts with getting all of Europe truly on the same page. And I think that there is a deep disconnect within Europe, in addition to what you alluded to with the US dynamic and Europe. So
fair point.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I wanted to complete what Jana said, and in French I would say I will mettre les pieds dans le plat, say something really disturbing. If you have a look about the current situation of Europe, and when I say the current situation, this is with the Trump administration, I think we are strongly than ever in a sort of strategic isolation. Mm-hmm. If you have a look to the war in Ukraine, there is two countries in that world that I won't say have interest that the war in Ukraine continue, but they take a lot of advantage of that war in Ukraine. This is China and the US. Mm. In the case of China, in both cases, with China and the US, why do they take they take benefits from the war? Because that war allowed them to vassalize two countries or two kind of countries. This is Russia for China, this is Europe for the US. And saying that, you have to have in mind that they have a lot of interest in that vassalization. Just have a look to the July trade deal between US and Europe. We signed that deal because of the war in Ukraine and because we need insurance that the US will still support, help us and guarantee us that they will still stay in NATO, you see? And that's the same for Russia and China. Then saying that, it appears really, really difficult to define in that perspective the transatlantic relationship today, because this is not equality, this is vassalization. I am from the country of de Gaulle, and he used to say that we need to be allied, not aligned. I think today we are aligned. I'm not sure it will allow us to stay allies. And that's not my words, that was the words of Donald Trump during his first mandate. And that's really important to have that in mind, I think.
Sylvie, I want to pick on that. And actually, this was the question I was wanting to ask you to tee up the last few minutes of our discussion. There's a sense that Europe needs to do Europe. And European leaders say that as keenly as plenty of Americans. But the challenge is that the US interest in the Euro-Atlantic has been because over the last sort of 50 years, that's been its principal challenge to its security and or 70 years, to its security and to its economic prosperity. When the US principal challenge is coming from China, and accepting that in Ukraine there are North Korean soldiers, Iranian-designed drones, and plenty of Chinese support. So there's already an interconnectedness between the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic. The Chinese threat is already here in Europe physically, as well as plenty of economic and espionage threat too. To what degree can Europe continue to cut its own path in its relationship with China without further impacting on how the US sees the Euro-Atlantic, the transatlantic relationship?
I do think that's a really difficult challenge to navigate, sort of a tightrope, because on the one hand, I know there's a discussion about some countries feeling that if they don't dedicate sort of hard defense assets toward a hypothetical fight with China, that might sway U.S. opinion otherwise. I think the bigger specter right now is the economic policy toward China. 100%. And I think that's actually where it should be. I think a lot of the discussions over, should Europe contribute in terms of hard military assets to an Indo-Pacific fight is misplaced. I think, first of all, there are very few European countries that actually have the capability to do that. I think, secondly, that's not something that the U.S., and since I'm not Caroline Levitt, I actually don't say this officially, but I don't think that that's something that the U.S. would prefer, simply because it doesn't make a lot of logistical sense. And I don't think that's what the call is for. I do think that because from the U.S. standpoint, of course, and again, not speaking from the administration, but sort of a U.S. defense analyst standpoint, looking at the problem set, to your point, James, they are incredibly interconnected, not just Russia and China, but you also alluded to Iran. And then there's increasing North Korean interplay as well. So sort of the four named U.S. threats. I think it's difficult for the U.S., given our look at China as the pacing threat, to sort of divorce Europe's outlook on China from what our concerns are with regard to that threat. So I do think there is an element of trying to find alignment there. And I think that is actually much more challenging, ironically, than on the Russia threat, just because there are such deep economic ties with so many European economies and China. It's a problem the US faces as well, obviously, when it comes to trying to figure out a way to sanction your way out of the problem. So that, I think, is an area of definite tension going forward, because I know for many European countries, to include Germany as well, of course, given your economic ties with China, it's going to be something very difficult to square.
Sylvie, Matti, I want to ask you all very briefly. We've only got 5 minutes before someone presses the red button and we all get launched out through the ceiling. But should European trade and economic policy towards China be moderated to maintain the US interest in Euro-Atlantic security? Sylvie.
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure to have the answer because, well, I think we have to improve our autonomy, our sovereignty, and it means probably also to decide what may be our partner in defense, in economy, etc., depending on our interests. But I'm not sure that it is really easy in Europe to define one European interest in reality. And bargaining with the US or bargaining with China will imply different national interests, and that's the difficulty in reality. Moreover, all the other questions we may have concerning value, human rights, etc., etc. But that's a really good issue, and I think we may begin to try to answer that question.
Matti?
Maybe not that much to add to that question, but on like European role in the Indo-Pacific. So to me, it's quite clear the primary focus of Europeans should be in Europe, because playing a decisive and a meaningful role in the Indo-Pacific, I think, is far less important than ensuring that deterrence in Europe holds, and particularly if a crisis erupts in the Indo-Pacific. Because there is also that potential risk of a coordinated aggression, and in such scenario, Europe would bear the main responsibility for maintaining European defense and deterrence. So that's why the focus should ideally be in Europe, particularly for the bigger players that play a major role in European defense: Germany, France, UK.
I remember Ken Brathwaite, who was the ambassador to Norway in Trump's first administration. He pointed out to me that in terms of a northern sea route through the Arctic, the first Western stop after Japan was the Norwegian coast, which I just thought was a really interesting illustration of the way the two theatres come together as that sea route opens. But Jana, Germany, I know you're not here to represent Germany per se, but Germany is a massive global trading nation, an enormous manufacturing base that relies on exports, and China is a hugely important market. How will the Chancellery feel if a future US administration starts to demand that the return for US investment in European security is a more US-facing trade policy?
You know, I think I would turn this around. Why should we be more critical with China or more hawkish towards China? Not because the United States asks us to be on their side, but because we have an own interest to see China more clear-eyed, to reduce our dependencies. If we are serious that this war against Ukraine is not only about Ukraine, but about the European security order more broadly, then China is the central enabler of this war. China makes this war possible on a daily basis. So China is working actively against us and against our interests. And we have not made China feel this way. I think in that sense, Donald Trump had a point when he was asking the Europeans for more sanctions. I think we have not started an honest discussion about how should we deal with a China that is actually enabling Russia's war and what can we do against it. And we should think about sanctions because it's in our interest, because it's our security, and not to do a favor to the United States.
Well put. Isa, I want to come to you with the last question of all. We've only got about a minute left. There are people in the UK MOD and in fact in NATO headquarters who are using 2028, 2029 as a date by which Europe, NATO must be as ready as possible. Now, I think that is just a forcing function. I don't think there's intelligence to say that war is coming that soon. But as a chief executive of a major defence company, can you honestly tell us that Europe has the industrial capacity to be ready on that timeline?
Not totally. Not in every area. Well, there are pockets where that level is already there. But in a total, so I would say that the clock is ticking. It's only 2-3 years. And knowing, I'll just give one example. If somebody decides to build an ammunition facility, production facility, decision made today, if there are no hiccups and everything goes like in a movie, it's a minimum of 3 to 4 years before it's operational, maybe even 5. So that's a reality. Then there are areas where decisions are by far much faster. And then we are just talking about ramping up the capabilities of something the companies are already producing today. So developing new capabilities and so forth, so that's another story. So yes, as a total, we are in a hurry.
And the danger is that on this stage last year and the year before, there was the same cri de coeur around what the lead-in times are, and yet here we are.
Yeah.
And if the producers wanted to be really mean, they would mash all of those clips together and show them next year after the same argument has been made again.
Yeah.
Esther, Sylvie, Ashley, Matti, Jana, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.